Okay, so our topic for tonight is about the Tory confiscations that occurred in 1778, here in Clarendon. That decade was probably the most tumultuous decade, in this town's history, with all of the New Hampshire grant versus New York grant, controversy, who's running, Vermont. But in 1777, the events lined up for what happened here in 1778. That, January 15th, 77, Vermont declared independence. We're not New Hampshire, we're not New York, we're us. By July 2nd, Vermont adopted, the new government here, state government, adopted a constitution. But then just 5 days later, you had the Battle of Hubbardton. And not less than 6 weeks after that, in the middle of August, you had the Battle of Bennington. So at this point, the Revolutionary War has gotten up close and personal for Vermont. This brand new state, the state didn't have money. It's barely just forming its first government. We're in the midst of the Revolutionary War. And the mechanism that the new legislature in Vermont chose to finance the war, because we didn't have laws, we didn't have taxes, they passed a tax on Tories, which is very easy to calculate. What you own, the tax is 100%. Basically they were taking everything, all of the property, the land, the structures, the animals, the equipment, that these were total confiscations. And Vermont had, I don't know how many totally in Vermont, but Clarendon had 30 confiscations, 30 men whose property was confiscated. And that was more than any other town in Vermont. And whether Vermont just had a lot more Tories, Clarendon rather, had a lot more Tories than other towns in Vermont, or Clarendon was more diligent in weeding out the Tories. But there were 30 of them, which was a lot for the population at the time. But it was the proceeds from selling, taking their properties, selling it off. That's what Vermont used to finance its war efforts. In the history book done in 1976 here in town, there is a chapter talking about the confiscations, the listing, the 30 individuals whose land was taken, but it didn't say what happened to them. So a few years ago, I was kind of curious. It's like, okay, we had all these people. What became of them? So I went on the internet, started researching them. And one after another, it kept coming up that in 1778, they were on this tax list in Bennington. And I'm thinking, what's going on? Was Bennington a very Tory-friendly place that they took shelter? When they were booted out of, Clarendon. I had no idea. But they were in Bennington. So I contacted the Historic Society down there in the Bennington Museum, and they put me in contact with a gentleman, Bob Hoare, who was writing a book. And I talked to him last summer, I think, and he hadn't finished the book yet, but he was going to be talking about this. So at that point, I started researching, the individuals to find out what happened. The reason they were in Bennington is because they were arrested. First some escaped. They got out of town before they got arrested. The ones that didn't get out of town first were arrested. Most of them were brought down to jail in Bennington. There were a few arrestees that may have gone over to Windsor. But basically Bennington was the center of the Revolutionary War effort, because at that time, Bennington was the most developed community, in the state. That you had the facilities down there for managing a war effort. So this is why they were on this. Then it was called a tax list, because basically the confiscations was deemed a tax. Just happened to be a 100% tax, of what they had. Of the 30 individuals, whose property was taken, 3 of them died during the war. Some of these they escaped. They crossed over into British lines, and several of them joined the British, army. 3 died, during, they didn't survive the war. 10 of the 30 made it to Canada. 10 made it, ended up in New York. New York, for whatever reason, was much more Tory friendly than Vermont. And that might stand to reason a little bit in that, a lot of them, some of them, they came from there, and, they had connections and roots there, but 10 went to Canada, 10 ended up in New York, 1 ended up in Massachusetts, 3 ended up elsewhere in Vermont, not Clarendon. And only 1 was ever allowed back into Clarendon, and that was Daniel Marsh. And I don't know what it was about him, but all was forgiven. The legislature, I think in 1782, allowed, basically approved him coming back and getting his property back. And then some years after that, the person who had bought his land, when it was auctioned off, petitioned the state to get paid for his losses involved with that. But Daniel Marsh did get his property back, and that would have been, down here on, Middle Road. But he is the only one out of the 30 that came back here, because basically, you're gone. And, with 10 going to New York to more Tory-friendly communities, and 10 to Canada, which of course was, they're Loyalists, in Canada. And even people that didn't go to Canada, they were petitioning, many of them long after the war, for their losses, that the British government, they lost their property here in Clarendon, and the British government was paying some of them, for their loss, but it was years and years later, that was occurring. And that was for both people who went to Canada and people who were still in the US. But that was up to the British government. This book here, it's State Papers of Vermont, Volume 6, Sequestration, Confiscation, and Sale of Estates. Between 1918 and 1991, the state published what they call their State Papers series. And in this series, I think there are 29 books in all. The first 18 are useful to us, and I acquired 13 of the 18, haven't found the others yet. But this book in its entirety covers in great detail the individuals, not just Clarendon, across Vermont. The legal documents of showing, when they took their property and they're auctioning it off, first they had to see, did they owe any debts? So if they're, taking, pick a name, Jeremiah Spencer's property, first they were checking, did Jeremiah owe anybody money in town? And the debtors would get paid, the state would take the rest, of the proceeds. But the details of, their land being sold, who was buying it, and sometimes one person's buying the land, someone else is buying the oxen, or other pieces of the equipment. So for researchers who may have family members that were affected here, and some of them would be collateral, you're thinking, okay, these people were kicked out in 1777, 1778. Of course, their descendants aren't here, for the most part. Only Daniel Marsh came back. But a lot of these were just like in the Civil War, where you had family on both sides of it. Some of these people were related to people that stayed. The fact that, some families may have bet, okay, there's no way this ragtag farmers and merchants are going to defeat the greatest military on the planet. Okay, I'm going to bet with them, versus people that instead are betting on, okay, no, the king's got to go, we're here. And, they can be in the same family. But there is tremendous detail, available. Not particularly exciting detail, but you see the transactions, and for a lot of these people, what they owned, at the time. There was no, essentially it's, the men, okay, the men owned the property, and the men, if they didn't escape across the British lines, they were arrested, okay? The wives and children weren't arrested. They're still here. I mean, some of the wives and children managed to, get out of town, make their way to Canada, but some of them were still here. And in those days, you did not have any social programs. Okay, now, the husband's in jail or he's fighting for the British, over in New York. And we've just taken your farm, your animals, your equipment, your livelihood. So you still had women and the wives and children are here with no provision. There weren't welfare programs. And in that era and continuing up through, the early 1800s, people were warned out of town. If you couldn't support yourself and the town could lay claim someone else is responsible for you, you would be basically ordered to leave town. If your roots were in Rutland, they're saying, we're not going to support you. You're Rutland's problem. And legally, you would be kicked out. Now here you have, we've just arrested the husband. He's a traitor to the country, so to speak. The town isn't going to support their wives and children. So it was a very, it was a very difficult, period. But there were individuals, and you find the details, in the book here, who stepped forward, not people in Clarendon, but people in New York State, people down in Pownell or in Rutland or some other communities, stepped forward, posting bond that they will support, these wives and children. And sometimes they would have been relatives or, they're connected in some fashion. But we know who these people are that said, okay, I will, cover them. And in some cases, the wives and children would have moved to places like Stephentown, New York, where their sponsor was. Some of them would have been taken in by other relatives. If part of your husband's on this, the Tories, the Loyalist side, but other of your relatives are here in Clarendon and they're on the Patriot side and they're still here, they may have taken in, wives and children. But some of them didn't have someone locally taking them in, and either they relocated to a place where they would be cared for, be it, New York or, Quebec, but if they stayed here, it would have been, there's some of them people funded, their existence for a period, but things were pretty harsh. They were not particularly taking, pity, on people, at all. And bear in mind, there was a war going on. And, wars never bring out the best in people. And a lot of these people were related. You had family groupings. We had Moses Bodish, whose wife was a Nichols, and Gideon Brayton, whose wife was also a Nichols, a sister to the other one. And you get a lot of connections. Then we had Joseph Brayton and Thomas Brayton, two of his sons. So the sons were old enough to own their own property at that point, but the whole family is, gone. Thomas Bull, he was the one he kicked out of this town, but he ended up in Danby. That was, other than Daniel Marsh coming back to Clarendon, he was the one who was the closest, if you will, to staying in the area. You had James Clark, who was an immigrant from, Scotland, who had first been in Canada, and somehow he came down to Clarendon, got on the wrong side of history, and lost what he had here and was back in Canada. Here's an example of what I had talked about before. Oliver Colvin, he was first cousin once removed to Jeremiah Colvin, and Jeremiah Colvin was the progenitor of the Clarendon Colvin clan, that's still here today. So this was a cousin. And we saw that in, other families. It's, siblings came, but cousins came. We had at least 3 Potter families, come here. And one of them was barely related to the others. You have to go back hundreds of years to find a connection, but they came here. But in this case, you had Colvin cousins here on both sides. One left, one stayed. Comfort Curtis, whose wife, whose was brother to Content Curtis, who was the wife of Joseph Brayton, that we had, just, mentioned. And we had John Curtis, who is Comfort's brother, another one where, again, the whole family is going. Thomas Green, he joined Burgoyne's army and stayed, fought over Saratoga. I mean, some of these people, we're talking that joined the British, they were fighting over Saratoga and down to Bennington, which is why ones that were taken prisoner, especially the Battle of Bennington, a British that were taken prisoner, if you were a British regular, a British soldier, you got better treatment than if you were a Vermont Tory. If you were a Vermont Tory and you were captured at the Battle of Bennington, the treatment was said to be much harsher than if you were a British regular. The British regular, okay, you're fighting for your country. The Vermont Tories, you're fighting against your country, as opposed to, that you're not British. You're American and you're fighting on the wrong side. We have Daniel Hill. He tried to get Vermont to pay him for his losses, saying it wasn't him. You had Daniel Hill and Daniel Hill Jr., and he basically threw his son under the bus, saying, well, my son was the one occupying the property. So, it was illegal to take it because I owned it, but he was occupying it, and so you didn't have a right to take my property just because he happened to be occupying it. And, that kind of argument might fly today, but, it didn't fly in, 1770s. So of course they lost their land. And then Timothy Hill, and that one I actually haven't figured out how he's related to the other Hills, but clearly there would be a relationship, there. There was Amariah, how, another one ended up, in Canada, Simpson, Jenny, Solomon Johns, you were interested in, Phil. Solomon Johns is someone we actually know where, he lived, where his site is, down on the Congdon farm, now, out in the field. But he's someone, and we have it on our website, that, he, ended up in Ontario, and a lot was written about him up there. Just as, we put up our markers and we're, honoring our Revolutionary War soldiers, well, up there they honor their Loyalists. And that makes perfect sense. And, he's a Loyalist that a lot was written about. And so amongst all of the people, we probably know more about Solomon Johns than, any of them. John Lee, another one there were several of these people went to Stephentown, New York. And so it could be that it's just part of their families, because a lot of these early settlers, they were related, they came from the same towns down in Rhode Island or down in Connecticut, or they had, they were related through marriage, to each other. And some of the families that came to Clarendon must have had parts of their families go to Stephentown, because that name keeps popping up. Stephentown is down near the Massachusetts border, that part of New York, there. There's Joseph Lewis, Daniel Marsh, as I said, he was the only one I ever allowed back, though his coming back was somewhat controversial. He, it was in 1782, there was a petition to restore his citizenship, in Vermont. He was down in Connecticut, living at that point. And the petition was signed by 51 men, and some of the ones that signed the petition were the local officials that were managing the confiscations. So something caused a total change of mind. It's like we made a mistake with this Daniel Marsh guy. They didn't do that for anyone else. And then it was an act of the legislature in 1782 letting him, back and also restoring his property. But it took another 3 years after that to actually get him his property back, because there's someone living there who's saying, wait a minute, I bought this property at auction. Daniel Marsh did go on to then represent Clarendon in the legislature. We took his property, kicked him out. 1782, we allow him back in. In 1784, we elect him to represent Clarendon in the legislature. So it was quite a rehabilitation for him, but it was not without controversy, because in 1786, there was a petition signed by 34 men in Clarendon to not seat him in the legislature, which means he had a lot of people here saying, okay, we made a mistake with this guy, we want him back in town. But it wasn't universal. But the people, wanting him back, obviously they prevailed. He was seated. He served for, 4 years, in this legislature. And it took till 1791 for the guy who had bought his property to get his money back for the improvements he made. I mean, those wheels turned, very slow. There was Joshua Matson, who would have been related to Francis, Matson, West Timoth Road, old house that's, the house is still there. The Matson family, had occupied, and again, this was just a split family, and, this guy was a cousin, again. Philip Nichols, earlier we had Zilpha Nichols and Rebecca Nichols. Again, there weren't a lot of total strangers moving here. There were people that are moving here because they know people that are moving here, and friends and relatives from, where they came from. And, you get in these small population places, families are marrying into families. Elijah, Osborne, he died, one of them that died, fighting for the British. There was Jeremiah Parker, this is one I haven't figured out. You had a lot of Parkers in the North Clarendon part of town, particularly, but they ended up spreading throughout the whole town. There were a lot of Parkers here, and I haven't been able to figure out how he's related to them, but he probably is. But this was one, he lost his property here, but he clearly was an unrepentant, Tory, because he was known, instead of being referred to as Jeremiah, he was known as Tory Parker. Right up till he died. He had originally come from, Massachusetts, and after being in Clarendon, he settled in Charlestown, New Hampshire, and then it ended up, coming across over to, Springfield, Vermont, ultimately. But he went through, and he lived till 1833, so he spent a lot of time known as Tory Parker. So, the war may have been lost, but he did not give up his British loyalty, in that regard. Samuel Richardson, another one who joined the, British Army. And this book does include the ones that petitioned the British to get paid, for their losses. There was a bunch of Spencers. Spencer is another name that people, still here in town. But the Spencers in the 1800s were, very prominent, and into the 1900s, very prominent family in town. But we had Barnard Spencer, who, ended up in Canada. Then we had Benjamin Spencer. He died at Ticonderoga in 1777. He got out of town, over to British lines, before the confiscations began. But that didn't stop the confiscation process, of the land he left behind. Hazelton Spencer, who's the son of, Benjamin, he made it to, Canada as well. Jeremiah Spencer, who is a, cousin, but even though we had 4 Tory Spencers here, there are other Spencers that were here and stayed, another, kind of split, family. William Sutton, he came back not far from here himself. He was one of them that came back to Vermont, to Brandon, afterwards, so not too far. Daniel Walker, another, you have Lewis Walker, in Chippenhook, and, the progenitor of a very large, Walker family. Well, Daniel was Lewis's first cousin. And, he ended up in, Canada as well. But one of these guys, let me see which one made it to Canada, and it didn't work out so well. He wasn't there all that long, a tree fell on him. But, and all of, what I'm, looking at here, this is on our website, in our Soldiers and Wars collection. It's called Tory Prisoners, I think is what I labeled it. But, all of this, and this is something I update periodically. I updated a little bit yesterday, as I go in, and because sometimes as time goes on, there's more and more data that becomes available, on people, and so I can flesh out people a little bit, more. But it's, was a, at times it's hard to fathom, here, okay, is a town, it'd be sort of like saying everyone that belongs to, this political party today, you're going to jail and we're taking all your property. I mean, that was kind of, the equivalent, except here you're in a wartime situation and you're in a state that, well, it wasn't even a state yet, but, you're in Vermont that has literally just formed its first government. It does not have any revenue stream, does not have much of anything. They just formed. This was the first tax. And to put in perspective, I looked up in 1770 the estimates of population. And bear in mind, 1770, you still got the New Hampshire versus New York thing going on. And you've got, no one is taking a census of, okay, this is Vermont, because no one considered it Vermont, at the time. That the estimates range from 10 to 25,000 people is all that was here. And, most of this was wilderness. Fast forward to 1780, now you've got a Vermont government that's been in place for several years, and, a lot more control. And estimates range from 40 to 47,000 people, that I saw, in Vermont. Which means you go back to 1777, 1778, clearly there would have been 30-some thousand people, here in Vermont. That's not much of a base to raise tax, to fund a war, to do much of anything. And, so that's why it starts becoming a little understandable that it was expedient. One, we don't want these people here because, they're on the wrong side of the equation that we've decided here. The war is on our doorstep over Hubbardton, down Bennington, or, Saratoga. We don't have any money, or we don't have a system really to raise money, at that point in time. So, great solution. We get rid of the people we don't want and we take everything they have. And that's basically what happened. I mean, it could never, it's not the way it happened in the other colonies, because the other colonies were long established. They had systems. They were more populated, all of them were more populated than, Vermont was. More difficult than Vermont was, because this was new territory. There were very few people. Anyway, prior to researching these people, nothing was documented as to what became of them. We knew who they were, we knew their property was, even here, their property is confiscated, but you don't know what became of them. It's almost as if that part historically wasn't that interested, it was more the initial action. But it was just kind of curiosity that, led me to start, researching them. Dave, you had a question?
I was going to comment a couple of things. One is Daniel Marsh. He actually got credit for Revolutionary War service prior to when he got in trouble as a Tory. So, Kevin, do you know, is he buried in the Marsh Cemetery there?
No, I put some stones in both cemeteries, the Flats and the Marsh, with Marsh names on them. I really have taken a look.
And Dave, on what you were saying here, some of these people had served in the military in the French and Indian Wars. Some of these people may have been veterans in the 1760s down in Rhode Island or in Connecticut. But it was sort of a different war, different time. When they were serving in the military before coming here, they were British. They may have been American, but people considered themselves, you were still British subjects, and they were serving in the military, that they were veterans. It's just the Revolutionary War came and everyone had to pick a side, and the side they picked, was not the side that the newly formed Vermont government said was going to be tolerated.
The other thing I wanted to mention about was Francis Madison, and I think you said he was cousin to Joshua. And Francis Madison lived over in Tinmouth, and he lived where the Squire farm is, and he got killed in a confrontation, a shootout, on his door, on his front yard. And it's written about in detail in Danby history. And he got shot by a bunch of Loyalists that came and accused him of being a spy because he went over to the Whitehall when the British were invading down the Champlain Valley. And he alleged he was looking for protectionist papers. And they considered he was, giving them knowledge about,
I'm sure there was a lot of that.
And anyway, there was a confrontation, and he ended up shot in the chest and it killed him. And they confiscated his land in Tinmouth, which was the Squire property now. And they buried him in the gravel pit on the south side of the Squire Road there that goes through the Squire property. And then the road crew in around the 1930s or something like that were, by hand digging out gravel from that gravel pit, and they struck his grave. And so they disinterred him from that gravel pit and put him into the cemetery that's there on the Squire property, which contains a lot of nobles. And they put him in an unmarked grave, except for a field stone there. And Henry Potter, who I bought my property from, was a predecessor in the Potter lineage. He went to his dentist when he was about 18, and his dentist had I guess that's John Irish, isn't it? That was killed there.
Yeah.
And he had his skull, which when they disinterred him, they sent the skull to the Vermont Historical Society, thinking that it might have some kind of historical merit. And of course, the Historical Society wasn't really interested in human remains. So apparently Henry's dentist was the person that was connected to the Historical Society and got the skull back, and he knew Henry lived in that neighborhood, so he gave the skull to Henry. Henry took the skull and left it upstairs in his house for years. It was there. And when he was about 90, he decided that that skull should be placed with the rest of the body. And so at 90, he was a little infirm, and he asked me if I would help him to put the skull back where it might belong. And I said I would. And so he showed me where the field stone was that marked the disinterred grave of John Irish. And we dug down about 3 feet, and I hit something that could have been a bone or something like that. And I said, I think we've gone far enough. And it was in a shoebox, the skull. And so I looked in the shoebox, and sure enough, there was a skull in there. And so I just put shoebox, skull and all into that hole and covered it up.
Well, thank you for that.
And, well, we don't have any headless horsemen running around Chilliwack.
Well, that's good.
So that's good. But John Irish was, he was killed because of basically what we're talking about, only led to his...
Well, I have another one here with Solomon Johns. Yeah. I will, following what Dave just said, I do have here kind of a interesting account, and this is from the October 1947 Vermont Quarterly, in an article that was called "Indian and Tory Raids on the Otter Valley, 1777-1782." Late in July or early August of 1777, many of the inhabitants were still out of the Otter Valley, having evacuated immediately after the Battle of Hubbardton. But one persistent Whig, Nathan Tuttle of Rutland, stayed behind to defy the Tories. Tuttle, who was said to have been a heavy drinker, was drunk when he met up with a party of Indians led by 2 Tories, Solomon Johns and Gustavus Spencer of Clarendon. Tuttle immediately started a row and dared them to take him. The taunts continued until Johns got so mad that he ran Tuttle through with his bayonet and killed him. Spencer and Johns then tied stones to his body and threw it into the creek below Goulkins Falls. After having disposed of the body, they all went to Joseph Keeler's house nearby and told him the story, begging him to swear secrecy. After the war, Johns was killed in Canada by a falling tree, and so Keeler felt it was safe to publish the particulars of Tuttle's death. So actually, Solomon Johns was the one who wasn't there all that long before a tree fell on him up in Canada and died. But it was a different time.
I was going to mention John Irish's wife and kids. They confiscated his land, and the family moved to Danby. That's why the account of John Irish's killing, from his wife's perspective, is in the Danby history.
Yeah, and John Irish would have been one of the Tinmouth confiskees. He would have been one of the Tinmouth, confiskees. That's why he's not on my list. I was only Clarendon. Because Irish, actually, he was in Tinmouth.
Yeah, and you're right, Francis Madison was in Clarendon. He was actually owned part of the Potter firm.
Right.
He was, the guy that probably cleared those meadows and stuff and right back at the house.
Yeah. In fact, the Solomon Johns...
In fact, he's buried there. He's buried on the
Yeah. The Solomon Johns guy is actually probably one of the more interesting, ones here. He had served in the British military as a lieutenant in the King's Rangers. August 1780, a guy named Steele Smith was paid for housing and feeding Solomon, another guy named William Buell, and their guards in Windsor, Connecticut. They had been arrested and brought to Windsor, where some people were jailed there. Colonel Ebenezer Woods was paid that same month for capturing both men. So they escaped from jail in Windsor, got captured again. And then September 1780, Lieutenant L. Nathan Strong was paid to bring Johns and Buell to Bennington, to house them down there in jail. But he ended up in Elizabethtown, Ontario, where he died in 1786. Guessing a tree fell on him. You know, but there's a lot written about him, and I think we have a separate entry in our collection, because I found this rather large account of him out of Canada. But we know where he lived, and Bill has done some work on the site. Right now it's part of the Clarendon fields. You know, I think it's kind of an interesting subject, but everything with the 1770s here, you know, before this, and you know, the New Hampshire grants versus New York grants, you know, Green Mountain boys, you know, coming here, and you know, some of the accounts, a few of which we've got on our, you know, website, you know, the accounts of what was being done to New York officials. In fact, maybe that was practice for what happened in 1778 with the confiscations, you know, when the Green Mountain boys were literally running New York officials out of town, you know, here, because this town was under New York control, you know, for a period, you know, until they were all afraid to be here. And one other thing I know is people were able to sort of switch sides. You know, some of the research we've done, we have Charles Buttons rather, you know, one of the absolute first, if not the first settler in town, where there were indications that he was also a Tory, but he owned a lot of property here, and he seemed to be smart enough to read the tea leaves and place his bet on the Patriot side, and said, I'm with you guys, and let his oxen be used to haul cannon over towards Boston. But there were some indications that, you know, he would have been a Tory. But, you know, just as with the New York officials that were here, if they were able to renounce New York control, you know, I'm not going to work for the state of New York anymore, you were fine. You know, they weren't going to kick you out of town. But if you insisted that New York, this is New York, and we're doing it the New York way, okay, you suffered the consequences. But it was the same thing with, you know, Tories versus Whigs, really. You know, Patriots versus Loyalists. You know, that if you were willing to say, no, I'm going to be on your side, you know, that would be okay. But if you're, you know, adamant, absolutely no, I'm subject of the king, I'm on that side, well, you know, that was the consequences. And you have to bear in mind, from that, the Battle of Hubbardston, you had, you know, people fleeing, you know, the area even. And so if you were a Tory, and the British are doing quite well in the war at this point, you know, at least up here, you say, okay, I'm going to be protected by, you know, the British. You know, you didn't have a whole lot of incentive to be saying, oh no, these guys are never going to win, because it kind of looked like they probably were. And it was the non-loyalists, you know, that were fleeing, you know, the area. And things changed rather rapidly. You know, that, you know, the new Vermont government kind of got control of things, and, you know, this literally was one of the first things they did. You know, so the situation changed rapidly as to who was on top, you know, of this game, and, you know, people chose sides, but people were able to switch sides, you know. rest is history.